Hey there. So from time to time, we will do a little video that we call Left on the Desk, and it usually relates to something that I wasn't able to get to in the sermon, or questions that came after the sermon, discussion that was had that relates to something that I didn't have time to get to in the sermon. So here, we're going to look at Psalm 12, last week's sermon, some questions and some topics that were discussed after our look at Psalm 12 last week. Now, Psalm 12 highlighted King David's plea to the Lord for help in a culture of lies. David summarized the problem like this, verse 2 of Psalm 12. Everyone utters lies to his neighbor. With flattering lips and a double heart they speak. That sort of summarizes it. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get to every possible application, every possible question that might arise out of a scripture passage like that in a single sermon, but I love thinking through follow-up questions. So here's some further discussion about topics that were left on the desk. For example, a couple of people asked me why I made the personal application of this idea of lying so prominent in the sermon, particularly when the broader context of Psalm 12 seems to be about those who are in positions of power using lies to oppress the poor and the powerless. Right? Here's how I answered the question. Psalm 12 is about systematic injustice, which I noted. However, even from the text of Psalm 12, the lies and the deceit don't seem to be flowing only top down, in other words, oppression and injustice, but they also seem to be flowing side to side, like verse 2, to his neighbor. Now, second, I pressed the personal application and encouraged our own self-examination about truth-telling because, quite frankly, that's the application we're most likely to avoid. In other words, I'm less worried about your ability, my ability, to see the lies of others as a problem. But at least for me, it's far too easy to ease our conscience by assuming that lies, at least the big ones, usually come from out there and not in here. But the clear teaching of Scripture, for example in Mark 7:14-23, is that all sin originates within each of our hearts. That's where it comes from. It flows out of us. And even as we recognize the reality of others' sin, Scripture also tells us that we should always first look within ourselves. For example, Jesus says this in Matthew 7, and Paul writes this in Galatians 6. Start with yourself even as you restore or confront someone else. And if David, the author of Psalm 12, wasn't immediately aware of this need to look introspectively when he's talking about sin, and particularly the sin of lying, if he wasn't aware of that at the time, he tragically soon would be aware of his need for that, because deception was at the very heart of his great moral failure when it relates to Bathsheba and her husband Uriah. In addition, a few others raised some questions about the particulars of deception and lies in the gray areas of living in a broken world. In other words, are there cases where deception would ever be necessary? So without doing a comprehensive discussion of Christian ethics and every potential hypothetical situation, here's a quick list, in no particular order, of some nuances and some caveats about what I think the Bible's teaching on truth does and doesn't mean. Just some things to continue to think about. Right. So when it comes to lies and truth-telling, a couple of thoughts. The point guard who pump fakes in basketball to deceive the offender. The baseball pitcher who throws a changeup that tricks the batter because it looks like a fastball. They're not sinning. They're just competing in a game where everyone agrees to the same set of rules. Okay? Something else. The collection of national intelligence through deception, I think, can be legitimate if it's done within lawful authority and with checks on abuse. Right? We live in a broken world, and sometimes things like intelligence gathering, even through means of covert action, are necessary to protect and defend those who are in need of protection. Along similar lines, I think you could say undercover police operations to prevent crime, to prevent greater injustice. They can be warranted, again, within lawful authority with civil safeguards against abuse. Another thought, the command to be honest doesn't eliminate the need for wisdom and discretion. In other words, how you say stuff, when you say stuff, to whom you say stuff, it still matters. Remember the rhyme. Just because a true thought pops into your head does not mean it needs to be said. Finally, last thing, the requirement to tell the truth never eliminates our obligation to speak truth with the motivation of love, Ephesians 4, and the manner of grace, Colossians 4. Love and kindness are not compromises if you do them rightly. They're not compromises on the truth. They're biblical commands for how we speak the truth, our motivation and our manner. Anyway, great and interesting topics. Let me know if you'd like to continue the conversation further on any of them one-on-one. For now, this is Pastor Tom, and that was what was left on the desk.